Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. Even though it is often going against conventional wisdom, I think it is very useful to do that. And with this and the NPT feeling a bit like the knight in the Monty Python, I'm not quite dead, I suggest that we resume the discussion, and we have a good half an hour for conversation. Anton, please.
Thank you, Camille. And I have a question for Carl Massar. Carl, you mentioned that there is a lack of common vision. What do you mean by this in the case of Iran, for example? Or you mean, nuclear vision in general, including nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy? And again, I'm especially interested in Iran. And a quick comment on when, for example, Iran decided to keep all options open. I think it was done a few years after joining NPT, because my understanding, what I've got from interviews, that Iran started non-declared activities around 77, so which means that they joined 68, and the treaty entered in force in 70, so it was after. In the case of North Korea, probably it's more difficult because North Koreans joined NPT much later.
We take a few questions. I have Jean-Pascal Zanders here.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal Zanders. My question is to Carlo. I think I would share most of your assessment concerning the absence of a non-proliferation norm. Then again, I have a different reference framework in the sense that my background is chemical biological weapons. There we have total prohibition on acquisition, possession, and use of the weapons. However, with your final point concerning empirical evidence that the NPT has no effect whatsoever, I might urge an element of caution, because very often with weapon programs, we only start to discuss them when they become visible to a certain extent, and that we see a number of indicators that the program might be working. However, if I relate to the history of chemical weapons and look at a document such as the 1925 Geneva Protocol, just one page, extremely weak, most people would say. However, in many of the national debates, what has happened is that because of the existence of that document, it became increasingly difficult for the promoters of chemical weapons to justify going down that particular route. So my argument would be with the NPT, particularly if we are at the stage of initial decision-making, when people are undertaking feasibility studies and so on, if an element of doubt creeps in already at that stage, the NPT might just be the added element not to go to the next step of that. But for most cases, I would argue we don't even notice that. It's only later, if there's a historical study, that might be revealed. At the time itself, we don't know. So I would urge a certain element of caution in the way you frame that argument. But on the whole, I would kind of agree.
We have one comment in the back.
Hi, thank you. Again, for Carlo, you're going to get all
I'm not the only one on the panel.
This is true. And my question really piggybacks on the previous question, which is a general word of warning, and we know this from other literatures when you look for empirical evidence of the dog that didn't bark. And that is that you're often looking for what we call an off-axis or off-equilibrium path outcome, right? So you have this in literature on deterrence as well. You're trying to show an example of the country that was deterred, but they may not have entered into the first stage of what we'd call the game in the first place, knowing that what the outcome would be. And here we have the problem of knowing the counterfactual for the NPT. This is a serious, I think, threat to what you're. Again, I happen to like your argument, and it's something that I don't think it gets considered seriously enough. I just think that before you have a clear, we have no evidence of this, It's true, but we also don't have evidence that it didn't affect.
Maybe we take Azriel, and then we break to get the panel a chance to react to that.
I wanted to questions to Michael Nacht. Two quick questions. You mentioned Libya. Was it therefore a mistake to overthrow, or at least help to overthrow Gaddafi when he came out from the cold? And look what happens to a regime who comes out from the cold. So what sort of lesson do we learn from this? And the second issue about the missile defense issue. Do you see any optimism in regard to cooperation between the United States and Russia on missile defense?
So maybe we go back to the panel. Carlo first.
Yeah. Very briefly to Jean-Pascal and you, sir. Going nuclear is, I think, for every country an extreme decision. Yeah, because it involves a lot of financial means you have to invest in, and therefore there must be, let's say, a good convincing for your political elite cause to do so. Once you reach the point, you go, because you feel threatened by a domestic, regional, or international situation. Yeah, and I think that that's the important point. I mean, you have deliberations. I don't think. I mean, look, the Germans, they wanted to go nuclear, and they were stopped by de Gaulle when he came into power in '58. So he stopped basically the negotiations between France, Germany, and Italy in '58 of, on nuclear issues. This was a function for the German government because they had some doubts in the extended deterrence and in the security guarantees of the Americans. So that drove them. Once this was at least no longer a major issue for the Germans, they stopped thinking about going nuclear. But if you are, and I don't say that they are right, but if you are an Iranian and you think, I'm surrounded by the US, they kicked out Saddam, they tell me, you're next, for instance, if you have this kind of security concern, you will do it because you feel, your perception is that once you go nuclear, you will be treated differently, you are safe from any attack which might end in a regime change, and so on and so forth. So therefore I think the decision to go nuclear is a very heavy one taken by a country, and therefore the NPT doesn't hamper you. I don't think that you sit there and you think, oh gosh, we signed this treaty 20 years ago, no, let's not even think about going nuclear. I think it's a psychological thing. Yeah? And this might be different. I'm not an expert in chemical and biological weapons, so this might be different in the B and C cases. I don't know. Yeah? No evidence, that's true, but my point is always that exactly what I call liberal arms control ayatollahs, they tell us that it had an effect. And I say, I don't think so, but I know I don't have the evidence. You don't have the evidence either. So let's be serious. We don't know whether the NPT had any effect on anyone, not to go nuclear or to stop thinking about going nuclear. This is the argument, therefore I made this argument so strong, because usually I'm confronted always with the success of the NPT, and I think we should look, and Yair said it, so I will be short, we should look much more on how the Soviets and the US did agree on non-proliferation and what they did to stop others from going nuclear. One word on the norm. When I'm critical about the norm is, I understand norm from the literature on norms that at a certain point you are so socialized that it becomes part of yourself, not going nuclear. And I think the norm which the NPT provided was an instrumental one. You don't go nuclear because there were two nuclear superpowers who didn't have an interest that you went nuclear, and they would do whatever they needed to do to stop you from going nuclear. In a positive way, by giving you security guarantees, or in a negative way, by getting tough on you. So this was never a norm in the sense you have norms discussed in, let's say, constructivist or postmodernist literature. This goes far beyond. This is something where you say, I don't even think about it because I don't consider it as part of my own security identity, security culture. And this was never the case, I would say. Therefore, I would never call the NPT or non-proliferation a norm which was out there. It was a behavior.
Bruno, you wanted to jump
I
in?
have this vision of Harald Müller with a turban on his head. It's quite weird. Look, I'm not a postmodernist guy, far from it. But 3 quick points. When 95% of the world's countries are not nuclear, sounds to me like a norm. Second, your rhetorical points about whether I've signed the NPT, therefore, is that a big problem if I can go nuclear? It's partly rhetorical, because of course you are right to say that a country which is very determined to build nuclear weapons will not be deterred by belonging to the NPT. But that's not the point. What we're talking about, and the kind of legitimate debate we should be having, and we are having, is how much does the fact that a country has subscribed to a set of norms, including the NPT, weigh in or is factored in the political calculus, which is infinitely more complex than nuclear or non-nuclear. Going nuclear is not an either-or decision. It's a much more complex than that, and 50 years of histories of nuclear programs have shown that this is the case. So it's not a question of, do we want to go nuclear, do we not want to go nuclear? It's infinitely more complex than that. And I find it very hard to believe that the political cost effectiveness of going nuclear and the political cost effectiveness of staying in the NPT has not been at all in the mindset of the various Japanese, South Korean, Brazilian, South Africans, or Egyptian leaders who have thought about their future nuclear options. Third point, yes, there is evidence. There is evidence from interviews. There is evidence from interviews in the past 40 years of leaders who have said, or not said, but some of them have said, that the internalization of some of the non-proliferation norm was part of their calculus when thinking about their future nuclear option. I'm not saying that the evidence is entirely conclusive. We're talking about counterfactuals, etc. But I would be a little more cautious than you are in saying that there is no evidence at all. Finally, on Libya, my personal point of view, and it's only for me, had I known just before we sent the Rafale on Benghazi that it might have an adverse effect on the Iranian decision-making process and that it would confirm Iran's belief that it needs nuclear weapons, would I have advised my president not to go and protect the people of Libya? The answer is a resounding no. And frankly, it's also a political cost-effectiveness. Of course, there are adverse effects, there are side effects. Does this mean that I would not have supported the intervention of Libya? Hell no. Speaking only for myself. And by the way, I suspect that either for Hollande or Sarkozy would have been the same. But my take.
I'll refrain from joining the conversation and ask Michael. But there are many people who have asked the floor. So Michael,
So very quickly on Libya, it was a sequence of events without taking the proliferation precedent into account. I mean, as I understand it, the British had contact with Gaddafi early on, that Gaddafi wanted to change his policies and join the international community in order to benefit from it, and was willing possibly to deal on his weapons of mass destruction. Then the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and there are a lot of American forces pretty close to Libya. And the combination of the two, Gaddafi is more amenable to discussing this, and the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, negotiates the removal of the weapons from Libya, which was viewed as a tremendous success of the Bush administration, even by those who weren't fans of the Bush administration. Then you fast forward after that, and Gaddafi's caught up in the Arab Spring, and there are all these rebel groups against him. And then Gaddafi says, I'm going to go to Benghazi, now the famous Benghazi, and wipe out the entire population, 200,000 people, because they were the hotbed of opposition to Gaddafi. And the president is, I think, here is one case where he's influenced by some of his advisors, including Secretary of State Clinton and others, that said you can't permit a genocide of that magnitude. And even then, the president chose the NATO route, a UN Council resolution You know, it wasn't the U.S. cowboy to the rescue. It was leading from behind. It was all of this carefully staged stuff, so that Ivo Daalder, my colleague and friend who's U.S. Ambassador to NATO, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs afterward, this is the way to do things. So this was all the plus side, how we got rid ultimately of Libyan WMD and Gaddafi. Then you have the odds. Look at the lesson learned by other nuclear aspirants about that. And we have to deal with it. So there I completely agree with Bruno. You don't have the choice at times to say this is really a bad decision because of the lessons learned by future countries about it. Jim Schlesinger, when he was Secretary of Defense, once said, and you're not going to like this, he said he was asked a question about his long-term strategy as Secretary of Defense in a Senate committee, and he said, Senator, when you're Secretary of Defense, a long-term strategy is a lot of short-term strategies stapled together.
Thank you. Let me. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
The other question was about U.S.-Russia. I'm not too optimistic about progress on U.S.-Russia Missile Defense Cooperation. Rose may have a lot more to say about it. Ellen Tauscher, her predecessor, has been the point person on this. There had been a number of very detailed presentations by the U.S. military, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in Moscow, going into great detail on the technical capabilities of the U.S. current and planned missile defense systems, the launchers, the network of sensors, the way the whole system picks up the missiles and all that, to demonstrate that it's only going to be capable, hopefully, of intercepting missiles in small numbers from Iran or from North Korea. But I know for a fact, because I heard it with my own eyes and ears, by the chief of the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces, who's actually not there anymore, that the Russian model, they've done modeling, and the Chinese have done modeling, both of which project enormous capacity on the part of U.S. systems. And they claim that by 2020, they could be an impediment to their strategic deterrent. And you know, Medvedev said before he stepped down as president, when he and Putin switched, he said that if we cannot make progress on U.S.-Russia missile defense cooperation, this will be grounds for Russia withdrawing from the New START treaty. So this is a big issue, and after a lot of effort so far, no progress. So at the moment, I'm not too optimistic.
So you have the floor. Just one practical point. We have normally 15 minutes to go to dinner, and at least 5 speakers, 5 questions from the floor. So I'll take them, but please be as concise as possible in order to allow the panel to respond. Please.
Yes, I come from Brazil, and as you mentioned, Brazil is one of the countries that has given up its voluntarily its nuclear military program, even though against the payment of significant benefit. My question is related to recent events in Brazil regarding its nuclear policy. In the last 2 years, both the former vice president and the main assistant to the president mentioned the right of Brazil to produce nuclear weapons or to go back to its military nuclear program. Brazil has refused to sign the additional protocol and has made difficulties for inspections in its enrichment program. So my question is, what does it tell people like you that deal with the subject regarding the eventual possibility of Brazil reversing its decisions? And maybe Michael Naktus also comment on it, how the U.S. sees the Brazilian behavior in this case.
Thank you very much. Odette, you no? Okay, then thank you. Emily was next. And then I'll go back to Shimon and Yair, and there is a question in the back over there.
Thank you. I think this was an excellent panel. Bruno and Carlo, what I like about your presentations is you say what you mean very quickly. Your points are very clear, and no, excuse my language, bullshit. So it makes it very good and easy to have the debate. To Carlo, I would just add, and this is a point from being a student of Yair, that we have to remember that the NPT is what gives the international community the grounds to confront a proliferator, the way the international community is trying to confront some determined proliferators. So I think in that sense, even if you don't accept the normative value of the NPT, there is something in the fact that it gives you the grounds for making the case. Interestingly enough, with regard to Iran, nobody remembers that. It's all about the fact that it's Israel's problem or maybe the U.S. problem, and people forget that it starts from the NPT, but it does start from the NPT, and it's an important point, I think, to remember. To Bruno, on the Iran issue, I think your points are intriguing and definitely something to think about. And I myself vacillate between, being a little bit more optimistic in that direction to being very pessimistic. I think 2012 has been a better year for international efforts to stop Iran, which moves me more in that direction. But your point about the NPT getting stronger, not weaker, is where I want to ask you a question, because I think the points that you raised here are a little bit weak. You said the universality. I think Carlo gave a good answer to that. You said the 2010 RevCon final document. I find that final document quite problematic. And then you said, Resolution 1540, there are also important cases of noncompliance, most importantly, Syria in the chemical realm with regard to 1540. So that's a little problematic. But just if you can say maybe a little bit more about this universalism versus compliance and noncompliance. And I think the case for the countries that are not complying and the challenge that this poses to the NPT is a much stronger argument against the NPT than any point about the universalism is as in support of the NPT. And you didn't even mention noncompliance. So I think that's quite important.
We have one question in the back over there.
I just wanted to ask Bruno, I suppose, to elaborate. You mentioned 4 scenarios, and I just wanted to maybe ask you to elaborate on why you put that figure at 90%. I tend to be a bit more pessimistic, and for those, I come to this issue as an area expert rather than an arms control specialist. And so for people who deal with Iran, they typically see Iran as aspiring to a nuclear weapons capability for the purpose of influencing the region and national pride. And both of those 2 reasons obviate, I think, the ambiguity scenario which you listed as the first one. So if you could maybe provide some reasonable basis for your 90% figure, I'd be curious to hear what that is.
Yair? No, you okay? Shimon, you wanted to jump in, or was everything said? No. Everything said already. At least everything you wanted to say.
Professor Nacht, I would like you to address the US-India relationship, and in what way did the Bush administration, and followed by the Obama in a way, undermining the NPT regime by, in a way, legitimizing something which, as I said, is quite problematic, A. B, referring to a remark that was made by Bruno, I wonder if you could deal with the question of to what extent is the US under Obama willing to extend nuclear guarantees to regional allies. And Bruno, you said that most of those who sit here who deal with Iran, including yourself, would write that if Iran were to go nuclear, then 4 countries in the region would join. We all probably guess who those countries at the end are. But you will agree with me that it is easier said than done simply to decide that, well, following Iran, we will embark on. At the end, you mentioned Egypt. I think that for Egypt to go down that avenue would take a major strategic decision. And I don't know whether even under Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood being so ideological, but at the end of the day, they are also pragmatists, and therefore they will know what is at stake.
Yes.
But in addition to that, I would say that even in the case of Iran second phase, I'm not speaking about Iran first phase of the Shah, it all starts with a benign civilian nuclear infrastructure at Bushehr, which allows you as scientists to toy with the nuclear fuel cycle if you don't have an infrastructure. And therefore, those countries who calculate that they may go down, they will start civilian because that is something that will help you to gain access to technology. And whether they will end up making that decision of military nuclear is still far away. And to Masala, I think that that is a point well taken, and I think that the Cold War is an evidence that then when we had two superpowers which were determined not to allow because their interest dictated it, so you didn't have. And now it's a new ball game where there is no common vision and no common interest. Nevertheless, I would say, finally, where the NPT can be in a way revised because there are loopholes in the nuclear fuel cycle, in the exemption, in the accession, and some other loopholes that can be closed so that when the moment comes and you detect a common vision, then an NPT which has been amended and revised might then not be a way simply to join and get away with the way other countries have done it so far. Thanks.
So let me turn to the panel for their final remarks. Please try to be brief so that dinner it doesn't wait. Michael first.
Well, I was asked 3 questions, so I'll try and wrap it up in a couple of brief comments. I do think that the U.S. and this administration feel very much that the NPT is of great value, and the precedent of making decisions now which would lead to its unraveling is something that weighs very heavily on the president and on the new appointees of the second administration. Obama is in the legacy mode. He knows that every key decision he makes now will be a part of the record book, and whether it's Brazil or others, which is fortunately much less of an important case at the moment, or Iran, I just don't think that, I do think he will try every avenue he can to avoid direct military action. Everything. But having said that, if everything fails, I don't think he will fail to act because he sees the precedent of not acting as being extraordinarily damaging. On Brazil, as one case, we don't have great leverage there, but we are friends, we're trading partners. There's wide recognition in the U.S. that Brazil is in some ways now the king of Latin America and certainly of South America. And but on the other hand, if there was to be a renewal of Brazilian nuclear weapons interest, and I used to meet with Jose Goldenberg and various Brazilians about this, I think the U.S. would play hardball. I mean, in East Asia, when South Korea and Taiwan flirted with these issues back in the 70s, the U.S. played really hardball. So, but hopefully it won't come to that. The U.S.-India case is a very interesting case and a difficult case. I think President Bush saw it as a strategic alliance, and he was willing to give India that sort of legitimacy there, even though they were not in the NPT. And it was also probably part of a policy to counter Chinese influence. And for whatever reasons, and I was not involved in this, there was a full review of that agreement by the Obama administration, and perhaps surprisingly, the president upheld the Bush decision. So it's well aware that this is I wouldn't say hypocritical, but it's a difficult decision. But it's been sustained and probably will be sustained. You have a democracy as a key ally becoming more important all the time. It's caused problems with Pakistan, it's caused problems with China, it's caused all kinds of problems. But this is you want to interject on that point? So, and then on nuclear guarantees to regional allies, I personally don't think so. I think extended deterrence is a key element of U.S. policy, and in all the iterations of the nuclear posture review, this came up again and again internally. If we start going down and up, at what point will we weaken extended deterrence to the point where Japan, South Korea, even Germany, who knows who, will reconsider? So therefore, instead, to use conventional means and other things, and still sustain the nuclear guarantee. But I don't think extending to new nuclear guarantees, such as to Israel, is probable. But as my wife is here, she knows how many times I've been wrong. And over many decades, I've been wrong tens of thousands of times. So that would be my...
So that's another line of as the Pope will never resign.
Never resign.
So Bruno.
Okay, first of all, it's a testimony to the success of the NPT that none of the hard cases is a democracy, and that it's absolutely impossible to imagine that a democracy will go nuclear without the NPT having crumbled first. So I'm not saying that the NPT will stay, but then it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine a world where Japan or Brazil crosses the nuclear threshold, exercises its sovereign right under the NPT, and I'm not saying violation. So we'll have to keep going on this norms debate. By the way, the Brazilian noises started exactly 10 years ago. They started in the beginning of Lula's campaign, even before Lula's first election. So it has become part of the standard Brazilian discourse. But I can't imagine Brazil doing more than hedging, which I think they will do, if the NPT... no, I'm kidding. Shimon, the great thing about Bouchier for the Iranians is that he provided them with a great cover story. It's not so much the technology that it gave them, it's more the political cover story. The countries, nothing original here except to say that my current list would be in that very hypothetical, would be in that order: Saudi Arabia, then Turkey, and way down the line today, Egypt. And I'm a big fan of the idea that if Egypt goes, Algeria goes, but that's not in the cards at the moment. On nuclear guarantees, I don't think that Michael would blame me for saying that it takes two to tango. You have to accept the nuclear guarantee as credible. And whatever, I'm certainly not going to dispute what he says, but how can you imagine that a country which sees the US as well as the UK, France, and others as having completely failed in their efforts to avoid the nuclearization of Iran, be a credible partner if they express their willingness to extend stronger guarantees? The great thing about the NPT, continued, is that it allows you to convince countries in the United Nations Security Council to say you have to sanction them because their program is illegal. The conversation killer about Iran is that their program is illegal. It's a conversation killer which is of great help when you need to marshal the diplomatic resources to convince countries that you need to impose UN-wide sanctions. And without that, in a world where the NPT does not exist, I think it would be much more difficult to convince many countries that, whatever one thinks of the political and strategic elements of Iran's nuclear program, at least the conversation stopper, it's illegal. My cumulative assessment, look, a very back of the envelope assessment. It's not even an assessment. It's Kentucky one day, as they say. In the coming 5 years, probability of a deal going from 5% to 20%, probability of military action going from 30% to 45, 50, 49%, probability of a regime change going from 1% to 20%, and probability of Iran staying at the threshold going from 10% to 10%. A very, very wild guess. But that's just an explanation of how I arrive at the sort of calculation that I mentioned. Well, the sort of assessment that I mentioned. But, you know, of course, this is open to discussion. Non-compliance. Well, the problem was, no, you're absolutely right. I would say that the hard cases are getting harder. But that does not mean that the softer cases are getting harder.
But in the overall assessment, those hard cases are having a maybe more significant impact on empathy than you're allowing.
Maybe.
And yeah, is there a point you want to join the conversation, or you are hungry enough? So, Carlo, for the last.
I have a quick comment on which was an excellent presentation on Pakistan. I'll tell you one scenario that's been given considerable thought in Washington is one in which there is another version of a Mumbai attack. Yeah. A group that may or may not be associated with the Pakistani army goes into India. There's another slaughter of innocent civilians. The pressure of the Indian government to respond is enormous. They do decide to go in conventionally in a kind of surgical strike way. They're defeating the Pakistani forces on the ground. Pakistan cannot tolerate still another defeat on their territory. And they have tactical short-range weapons that they use against Indian forces on their own territory. And that leads to God knows what.
Can I say that just for the fun of another contradiction with another speaker on my left, I find it quite reassuring that the army actually controls everything. Because the problem 15 years ago is that the army did not control everything. Or when you say the army, you have to refine the granularity of your analysis, because there is no such thing as the army. It's much more complex than that, as you know. But clearly the top leadership of the army 15 years ago did not control everything. However we analyze what exactly happened between the early 80s and 2003, 2004, there was no complete control by the top army leadership of the whole chain that comes from the president or chief executive down to the actual production of centrifuge parts and materials and everything.
The difficult part there is...
So thanks God for the Pakistani army. Is that live?
An added difficulty on the Pakistani situation, which is hard to analyze, is the scope of the insider threat. That is the key consideration. It's not that the army doesn't control the system, the chain. It does. And the army largely is actually a moderate nationalist force. But there could be individuals in that chain who are, strong Islamic fundamentalists, and they can collaborate to lead to materials and even weapons being taken by Pakistani Taliban or others. And that insider threat is extremely difficult, almost unanalyzable.
Carlo.
Yeah, I can be very brief. To Emily and I don't know who asked to you, Shimon. I mean, I have nothing against the MPT. I mean, go to another conference, reform it, strengthening it, and it will work fine the moment it is supported by managers of the international system. And that's my point. As long as we don't have this mechanism, which basically upholds norms, it will have no effect on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, that's what I'm calling upon. You can go to another. I mean, look, I come here to an arms control conference. So, I mean, I know as a Catholic, I'm in front of Catholics. You all believe in that. So let me have some fun by just provoking you. I think it has a secondary effect, and this is what I wanted to make sure. Yeah? I'm not saying to abandon it, but I'm saying the major problem is that it is no longer supported by major nuclear powers. Yeah? And so we should discuss about a potential vision for the second nuclear age and what order means in the second nuclear age. And when the major powers do agree, I think the NPT can be a wonderful instrument, yeah, then actually to deal with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Brazil, we live in the world where outside Western Europe and the US, with the exception of, I think, Jacques Chirac in a speech he made a couple of years ago, everyone else believes that nuclear weapons are still one of the currencies you need to be a global power. And I think this drives at least the Brazilian debate. Yeah? And I mean, I'm not that much deep into the Brazilian discussion, but I think, you know, if you look at the BRICS, the so-called BRICS, I mean, the R, the I, and the C, they are nuclear powers. The B is not a nuclear power, but it wants to be a pole in the multipolar world. That's the declared aim of Brazil. So apparently, you know, the perception is you have to be economically rich, but you need also nuclear weapons to be accepted as equal with the R, the I, and the C, and the US in this multipolar world. I think this drives a lot the Turkish debate and the Brazilian debate. One last word to Bruno. I don't know when he turned from a hard-nosed realist to a soft-speaking constructivist, but let me give you one thing. If, you know, the NPT would be so successful as a norm, and I don't think that numbers make a norm, why the hell did France, Britain, the US, and Russia, no, it was the Soviet Union at the time, insisted so heavily that Germany, by signing the 2+4 treaty, once again, after being a staunch ally of NATO, had once again to state it will never acquire, develop, and station own nuclear weapons on its own soil. A full-fledged democracy after 60 years. Either you tell me they were all crazy by asking this from the German, or there were some suspicions, sorry to mention the name here in Israel, that John Mearsheimer was right when he wrote Back to the Future.
Can I answer that question?
I don't know, ask Camille.
Go ahead.
No, I would say it's a very good point, actually.
Of course it's a good point.
I would say two things. First of all, it was 20 years ago, it was 91, at the time where France had actually not ratified the NPT. So I would argue that there are good reasons to say that 20 years ago, even if John Mearsheimer was wrong, the normative value of the NPT was not, according to me, what it is today. Second, if I remember my 2+4 correctly, a lot of this insistence was coming from one of the countries, and that was not a country represented at this table.
No, I know.
No.
Let me, and not Britain to be honest. So let me try, I will not try to wrap up a fantastic conversation. I would just look at my notes and I said, so the Obama administration needs to recalibrate its vision for the nuclear future, and that's complicated. Iran is not solved, but it doesn't really matter. Pakistan is worse, but hopefully the army is there. The NPT is irrelevant, but we would be much worse without it. So happy 21st century, and please join us for dinner. And for the record, please join me in thanking the speakers.
That was fun.